Hello, history scholars. Mrs. Olson here. Today's lesson is titled Scramble for Africa. Let's begin with our learning target, which says that you will be able to understand how European imperialism shaped Africa. Now, let's recap on what imperialism is. It's when a country extends its power and authority over other places. European imperialism in Africa establishes authority through military control, economic regulations, diplomatic pressure, and it also uses Christianity. All right, guys, before we get into the meat of the lesson, if you will, you want to have a piece of paper and pencil ready or another tab open on your computer so that you are taking good notes. Okay, here goes. So our essential question is, why Africa? Why did European countries choose the continent of Africa? One of the answers to that is that Europeans, they searched for the reality of Africa's fabled riches. So they'd heard all of these stories about how rich in resources Africa was, and they wanted to be able to have access to those resources and become rich themselves. So, what does Africa have? Well, it still does, maybe not in the same capacity as it did in the 1800s, but it still does have these resources. Okay, ivory, which is coming from elephant tusks and is banned from being harvested because you cannot kill a beautiful elephant in order to harvest only their tusks. Gold, diamonds, emeralds, and copper. All of these make people money. This note reads that before the 1860s, they were confined to the shores. So if you have a picture of Africa pictured in your head, only along the coastlines were the Europeans really, that's the only places that they were, because the interior was actually protected fairly well, so they couldn't penetrate past the shores or past the coastline. Fevers actually killed off many of white explorers trying to get into the middle of the continent. And there were rivers that allowed them to go in those directions, but those rivers were blocked. Okay, now, what they were figuring out was that the plantations that were being built in Africa were more lucrative. Lucrative means that you can make money, and there is a better way to make that money. So the plantations were more lucrative than buying crops from the villagers. So instead of the Europeans buying, say, rubber plants from African villagers, they are making their own rubber plantations and making a lot more money that way. All right, guys, here is a picture, a map, a graphic that shows you the resources in Africa. So just take a minute to look at all of the different resources and where they are located in Africa. Kind of a neat looking map because you get to see not only what the resources are, but where they're located. So for those of you guys not super great with geography, this is Southern Africa. This is Western Africa. This is the Sahara Desert in here, hence the oil and natural gas. These are where the Okay, guys, we are going to continue answering the question about why Europeans were choosing Africa. Another answer to that is that there was cheap labor, both in the form of slavery and also exploiting the African people and paying them very little or next to nothing, and putting them in dangerous conditions. There was this feeling of superiority over the Africans, because they believed that Africans were backwards, or they thought of them as savages, and they were in need of Christianity, or they needed to be taught how to be civilized. This should say or, excuse me. Because the African peoples and cultures were not as advanced as the Europeans simply thought that they were better than the Africans. So here is a picture that shows you Christian missionaries in Africa. Here is another one, a little bit more colorful, that shows you indigenous peoples and a European who is placed higher, above, more superior to the Africans who are on the ground. I wanted to share this one with you because the previous resources that you had were, one of them was called The White Man's Burden. So Kipling, the poet, wrote the poem called White Man's Burden. And so this idea is used in the imperialist era to justify why Europeans and Americans were doing what they were doing around the world. And the bottom of this reads that the political cartoon is showing Great Britain and the United States carrying the children of Africa and Asia to the mountaintop where civilization awaits them. And you see that the caption puts the word children, sorry, that keeps coming up, children in quotation marks, and that is trying to demonstrate the idea that the Europeans and the Americans were more knowledgeable, powerful, that the Africans didn't know anything as children don't know as much as adults do. Okay, continuing with the scramble. What does this mean, the scramble for Africa? Well, you have several different countries that are playing this game of the scramble, and one of them is Great Britain. Now, the modern day countries of South Africa, Ghana, and Nigeria are the ones that Britain ended up with and were after. As far as Belgium goes, you want to know a little bit about King Leopold. He is actually a really terrible guy. He happens to be, at this point in time, the least powerful ruler in Europe, but he does lead a very well-established European country in Belgium. Okay, and what he does is, even though he's not very powerful, he kind of sees what's going on in Europe and he wants to stake his claim. So he takes the Congo. Now I'm going to take a side note just for a second here, and I wanted you to actually watch something on King Leopold, but I don't think I can find anything. Hold on one sec. I don't think I can find anything that is really appropriate for kids to watch. And I know you aren't all kids, but I do have to keep it school appropriate. So I type in King Leopold, and here's what you get. Okay, so you kind of get your normal stuff from Wikipedia, from Encyclopedia Britannica. Look at this though. Why King Leopold should be remembered alongside Hitler. The Butcher of Congo, blah blah. He's responsible for the deaths and mutilation of 10 million Congolese in Africa in the late 1800s. King Leopold's Reign of Terror, the Hidden Holocaust. And look at this one from this year. Belgium tries to atone for King Leopold's sins in the Congo. Okay, so I wanted to take that little side note just to share that tiny bit with you about how terrible King Leopold actually was. Okay, so that's a little bit on King Leopold and his grip on the Congo Basin. And then we have Germany and a leader named Otto von Bismarck who wants to take control and did take control of East and West Africa. All right, so this is the bad guy, King Leopold, and here is Otto von Bismarck. You can always tell a German by their hat, this pointy hat right here. Okay, now all of these guys get together and they decide how they're going to carve up Africa. And this meeting is of the European leaders is called the Berlin Conference. So the European powers, they didn't want to fight each other on a continent they barely knew. Now, they were okay with fighting each other, but they didn't want to do it over this continent that was full of savages in their minds. So they met in Berlin to carve up Africa because they wanted to be civilized about it. But really what happened when they drew all of these lines and carved up who would control what parts of Africa is that they were ignorant of the different cultures and people in Africa and also of the geography of this large continent. So in some areas, they actually drew straight lines on a map. If you've ever looked at a map, you don't see very many straight lines for various reasons. But if you are, say, going to carve up a country, you should be aware of the peoples and the geography. So you're talking mountains, rivers, oceans, different landforms. How about people that speak different languages or historically don't get along with each other? Just drawing straight lines on a map, that's not going to work out very well. Okay, so a few graphics to demonstrate this idea and the decisions that were made in the Berlin Conference. Afrique. This one, even though it's not the best graphic, it isn't super clear. It is old. I wanted to show you this big ballroom that all of these European powers are meeting in, the big conference tables, and then on the wall, you can see that they have put up a map of Africa. So literally, they're trying to see who is going to get what parts. This one's a little bit better with the same idea that it's a big ballroom, big kind of conference room, probably in some very old palace in Berlin, and a map of Africa. Okay, so at the bottom of this, gotta wait for that to go away in just a second, it shows you who took what parts. So it says African colonies after the Berlin Conference of 1884. So the Congo, Belgium, there they are in the middle. The British took the southern part, South Africa. The French have West Africa. And I'm going to tell you about these gray areas, which are free, a little bit later. Okay? Now, Africa before European imperialism. Technologically, they were in the Iron Age. And to give you an idea of how unadvanced Africa was. Um, the Iron Age is, well, if we go back to the Stone Age, it goes Stone Age, Bronze Age, and then Iron Age. So there really wasn't any kind of modern technology in Africa when the Europeans came or went there. Politically, it was divided into several thousand units, and there are many different kinds of peoples in Africa with different languages and different cultures and traditions. Sometimes what happened is that it was divided because of different conquests that had happened over the years. And when the Europeans got there, much of Africa was actually in turmoil. And part of this had to do with the slave trade. If you were in last semester's class, you learned that there were African rulers who actually sold other peoples, sometimes their own, sometimes peoples that they had taken over to Europeans and Americans on the coasts of Africa. Okay, now how did Africa respond to this imperialist era? Well, some Africans resisted, as you can imagine. Some allied with the European intruders because they thought that they would simply go away, that they wouldn't last very long in Africa. So they decided, hey, what the heck, I will ally with them and be safe. Some actually tried to play the Europeans off of each other and make different deals with them so that the Europeans would fight each other. And what it comes down to is much of Africa actually gave in without a fight because it was hard to fight the Europeans with their advanced technology. You have to remember that Africans were in the Iron Age, really, and so they had spears. And those spears, and think about the Native Americans fighting the Spanish when they were colonizing. It is hard for a bow and arrow or a spear to do a lot of damage against technologically advanced weaponry like the Maxim gun or a repeater rifle. So not quite a machine gun, but it can shoot a lot faster than a spear can be thrown. So this is a Maxim gun, just to show you. Okay. Now we're getting to the end here. What are the results of imperialism in Africa? Well, by 1914, Europeans ruled all of Africa except for Liberia. And this was on the west coast of Africa, and it was actually founded by America for its ex-slaves. The other side of Africa, on the east side, Abyssinia, or today it's known as Ethiopia, this was an ancient kingdom who had fought off the Italians since 1896. So I'm sharing these with you because this says that by 1914, Europeans ruled all of Africa except Liberia and Ethiopia. Okay, so there's that tiny, tiny country of Liberia who has had its share of modern troubles. And here is Ethiopia on the eastern side. Okay, and perhaps the most important part, this is why we study history. What is the legacy of European imperialism in Africa? Well, we're going to talk about negatives and positives. I know some of you guys are saying, what is there positive about other countries taking over Africa? Well, there's going to be some, okay? So negatives, atrocities like what King Leopold committed against the people of the Congo Basin, oppression by all of these European powers in Africa. The best land in Africa was taken for plantations, and none of them are owned by Africans. And of course, resources and people were exploited. So, what are the positives? Those are things like schools, education systems were brought in. So were hospitals, even if the types of governments are not around today or didn't work necessarily back then for the different African people. There were systems of government brought in, and some of these African countries do have economies that can compete in or on the global stage. So the last part of this says that many African countries today remain dependent on Europe and the West for medicine, technology, and economic assistance. And you can look at this as a good or a bad thing or both. Okay, so a few things that show, or a few images that show the negative aspects of European imperialism. I thought this was a good quote to display the idea of King Leopold and his atrocities. And some positives. This is a coffee plant for some of you that have never seen what it looks like. It's schools, hospitals, government systems. Okay, guys, this brings us to the end of the lesson on Scramble for Africa. I hope you learned a lot, and if you have any questions, please ask. Bye!